Well, today we're going to move into John chapter 3. And John chapter 3, tomorrow will be in John 3:16. But today, looking at the situation with Nicodemus, it's John chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. And it says this, it said, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night, and he said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher from God. For no one can do these things you do unless God is with him. And Jesus said, Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? And Jesus said, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Now, this is not the only time we meet Nicodemus in the Gospels. You'll see Nicodemus later around the crucifixion, and Nicodemus is actually a believer then. But in this context, Nicodemus is a leader of the Jews, and he is a ruler of the Pharisees. And it also says that he is a rabbi, so he was very, very familiar with the teachings of the Old Testament. And it also says later in chapter 3, he was the teacher of Israel. I guess in this passage what you recognize is that Nicodemus was basically one of the best that the Jewish people had. He was an expert on the law. He was an expert in the New Testament. Yet the ironic thing about it is he didn't even know who Jesus was. He had all of this information. He had all of this content. Yet he comes to Jesus and he's actually asking him, now who are you after all? Christ was doing miracles. Christ was doing amazing things. Nicodemus knew that God had to be with Christ because he knew that no one could do these things in and of himself. Yet he still didn't know who Christ was. I think the lesson for you and I today is regardless of the amount of knowledge that we gain outside of Christ, it's not knowledge that leads us to Christ. It's God by His grace through His Spirit that leads us to Christ. And that's what Jesus said to him. Jesus said, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Now Nicodemus, probably the brightest of those around him, said, does that mean I must crawl back into my mother's womb? Basically in this passage, what you need to understand is that really and truly salvation is impossible without God. Being born again is a work that God does. It's not something that you do. Well, let me make it even more, just point it a little more clearly for you. It is not something that you did. Your salvation is not something that you earned. Your salvation is something that God did. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says, the God of this world had blinded the hearts and minds of unbelievers that they would not see the light and the glory of Christ. But God, Ephesians 2 says, being rich in mercy, even when we were dead in our trespasses and sins, made us alive together with Christ. Here's what I want you to know today, that your salvation was a work of God. It was not something that you did. So that as you begin to pray for the lost people around you, pray that God, by His Spirit, would raise them from the dead, because in and of themselves, they'll never see the light of Christ.